So anyone scared this time? Good evening. We'd like to call this Operations Management Budget and Government Accountability Departmental Budget Hearing to order for today, April 11th, 2023. My name is Councilman T.J. Clark. I'm the co-chair for the OMBGA Committee and also the Majority Leader for the Council, and I'm joined by Assistant Majority Leader Marilyn Rossetti, Councilman Amilcar Hernandez, Councilwoman Shirley Surgeon, and also Councilman John Gale, and we have Councilwoman Tiana Hercules, who is on our screen. And our first department today would be the Board of Education, and we have our superintendent and the chief financial officer here to present on behalf of the Board of Ed. I just want to recognize the HPA-TV. We're streaming from Frontier 6032 and also on Channel 96 on Comcast Xfinity. And we have our staff that is here with us. And just want to mention to our council colleagues, I know you probably have a lot of prepared questions, but please make sure that your questions are relative to the departmental budget for our departments. So with that said, we'd like to turn it over to Hartford Public Schools.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. Chief Penn is going to help me with the presentation. So to set the table for the meeting, we're going to give a quick executive summary of our current budget situation, the projected challenges moving into the next fiscal year and beyond. And we'll kind of tag team, if you will, as we summarize important background information relating to the vision for the district, the annual budgeting process, which will then lead into an in-depth conversation about the financial challenges that we're facing for the 23-24 fiscal year, as well as our proposed mitigation strategies. And of course, after we're done, we'll be happy to answer any questions. So we're going to move into some of the more critical information about the budget. And just for some context, in early January, after we had assimilated all of the relevant budget information, specifically a projected decrease in revenue due to grants and a projected increase in costs due to higher tuition, transportation, and the expected labor costs, we anticipated a deficit of approximately $24 million for the 23-24 fiscal year. We're going to go into those details on each side of the reasons for such a substantial deficit throughout this presentation. To close the deficit, we did make some tough decisions, including repurposing funding intended for innovation, non-personnel expenses, and the elimination of some vacant positions. And as we enter the 23-24 year, we'll need to find ways to increase revenue and or decrease expenses. These decisions, while intended to close the budget gap, right, will ultimately have an impact on our district. So in the first section of the presentation, we're going to go over the budget process and a little bit of background and how that is explicitly connected for the vision that we have for our district and the 4 strategic priorities that are used as guideposts for the financial decisions that we make. Just a quick highlight of our 4 priorities. We have a priority focused on high quality teaching and learning, which focuses on developing rigorous, culturally responsive curriculum and instruction, and making sure that that connects to our second priority, which is creating a welcoming culture and a nurturing climate across our schools so that we create a system of support to promote student engagement. And we want to do that in partnership. We want to cultivate partnerships with families and our community agencies and make sure that our students, our staff, and our partners are part of improving outcomes for our students. And lastly, our 4th priority is going to actually be the main focus of tonight's conversation, as it also includes ensuring long-term financial sustainability. And so for us, it's important that we revisit these priorities as our budget process has been guided by maintaining fidelity to these priorities and how, right, we want the priorities to have an impact on students and ultimately our community. So I'll preface that this slide might actually look a little familiar to those of you that joined the conversation at the last Lewy committee. So this data display is about our revenue, right? The money that we receive to operate schools. So if you look carefully at this chart, our revenue has been relatively flat to down over the last few years, especially when we think about excluding the recent addition of COVID relief funding from the federal government, right? Those that is shown on the yellow bars. There are a few forces at play here. One is state funding has increased on a per pupil basis as our ECS grant, what is the education cost sharing. That is the primary grant that the state uses to fund education in our state. That has become more fully funded. But as enrollment has declined, some of that state funding, most notably our Alliance grant and our magnet school operating grants, they have either gone down, they have either grown more slowly or declined. And so this has also been the case with federal funding. And something else that's been at play is that with revenue flat or down, it is not keeping pace with the growth of our costs, right? As some of us know, that just a 3% annual inflation rate, for us, that translates into an annual increase of about $13 million for a district our size. And, right, we also take into consideration that inflation is not a one-time cost, right? It continues to compound. That's compound growth, so that 13 million looks like 27 million in the second year and potentially 40 million on the third year and so on. So flat revenue, even when inflation was low compared to where it is now, it still creates a challenge and a problem for us each year. So we take now a look at the expenses, right? This is the opposite of the revenues, it's the money that we have to pay out. And we have to balance our revenues and expenditures each year. If we don't, right, that means we'll operate in trying to fix the deficit. So we're not allowed to end the year with a deficit. And if we have extra money or a surplus, right, we have to, right, return it to the city, like we did last year with the $8 million in general fund surplus that we had. And we can't carry a surplus forward to the next year. So for that reason, expenditures have stayed roughly in line with revenues throughout four primary ways. The decrease in enrollment, especially in the K-8, in the pre-K-8 grades, that has curbed some of the inflationary costs, right? When we think about lower birth rates, the transiency and how much some of our families move in and out of the city, and the allotment of open choice seats as part of the chef ecosystem. Another reason is controlling our expenses where possible so that we can be more efficient. Third, attrition of staff and vacancies. While that creates a pain point for us because we don't have the staff that we need fully to operate schools, it does create some savings every year. And lastly, we have made significant budget cuts over several years. We'll kind of take a look at that actually in our next slide here. This is also a slide that we tend to kind of repurpose. We've been in a cycle of budget deficit mitigation for up till the pandemic, right? You can see in the rows here at the bottom how eliminating positions was part of our deficit mitigation strategies in the past, most notably in the 2018, 2019, and before. So during those years, we were intentional in using the vacancies and the attrition from the turnover, such as potential resignations that we had gotten or folks that were retiring, and we also eliminated some roles. Going forward, use of vacancies and attrition is particularly important because we're a municipal government and we are directly invoiced by the state for unemployment benefits paid to our former staff members. And so when we think about the increase in vacancies and other small savings from remote or hybrid learning settings during the pandemic, that created a small surplus for us in fiscal year 2021. And then the influx of the pandemic relief funds allowed us to fund positions and expenses as we recovered from the pandemic. But now, as we look ahead to future years, we expect that we'll be back to a familiar position where our costs continue to outpace the revenue, right? The money that comes in. So we're going to be forced to make some tough decisions in years ahead. So Chief Penn, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you to talk about enrollment.
Terrific. Thanks, Superintendent. So enrollment decline, and you'll see it here going back to the 2016-17 year, a trend that was exacerbated by the pandemic for sure. It's a major contributor to our flat revenue streams and also our overall financial picture. You know, it puts in, that declining enrollment puts our future funding, especially our education cost-sharing grant and the Alliance grant at risk. And as you know, ECS is the primary grant that the state uses to fund education in the state through the distribution of about $2 billion a year to towns and cities across the state, using a formula that looks at overall enrollment, town wealth, concentration of poverty, and other key indicators of need. And we typically talk about the Alliance grant in conjunction with ECS because as an Alliance district, any change that we have in what would be otherwise ECS funding now comes through the Alliance grant program. So Hartford Public Schools is one of 33 Alliance districts in the state, which means we have some of the lowest accountability index measures. But I should also point out that there's restrictions on how we spend that Alliance money. It doesn't have the same universal application to our costs the way that ECS funding does. So we have to work closely with the state in an Alliance grant application at the beginning of every school year as to how we're going to spend that money. So declining enrollment also among our suburban students is also having a major impact on our magnet operating grant. This year, we saw a decline of about $7 million compared to what we expected to see in magnet school operating income. And we'll cover a little bit more about how the mechanics of that works, but essentially we receive grant funding from the state only from the suburban students that come in. We receive about $13,000 per suburban student toward the running of our magnet grant program. So what we saw, and you'll see this a little bit later, is about a 500 student decline in suburban students attending our schools versus what we expected. So what you'll see is kind of a compound effect that the negative enrollment is having for us as we look forward.
I'll speak a little bit about the impact of that enrollment because it's something that most urban school systems are facing locally across the state and even nationally. And so I know that it's natural to assume or interpret that decreased enrollment would lead to some savings. And I do understand that assumption and that interpretation, but there's no one-to-one relationship between reductions in enrollment and reductions in cost. Right sizing in a school system context is also challenging, and it's generally due because of the number of what we call sticky system costs that cannot be easily reduced when enrollment loss happens steadily and is spread across both grade levels and across schools, which is the case for us in Hartford Public Schools. It can even be more difficult for us to recognize any and recover any of the savings. So if, we have here an example, if we think about this from an individual student perspective here, as a system level, right, we're not able to make reductions in costs at the same pace as our enrollment loss. I use the example of a student that perhaps leaves a neighborhood school to attend a magnet school, but it's one student that has left in a second grade, but that class still remains, and the needs of that class remain, the teacher remains, the after-school program that student attends still remains, all of those costs still remain, even though, right, that school has 1 or even 5 less students. And so as a system, right, we're not able to make those reductions in costs at the same pace as we lose the students. And then to further complicate the enrollment picture, as part of actually a recent analysis, we found that Hartford could lose up to 1,300 students over the next 10 years, and that's as part of the updated CHEF settlement. And so, right, we have to think about schools and enrollment loss eventually distributed across schools. We have to think about the impact on staffing. But, you know, the district could pay potentially an additional $30 million over the next 10-year period in tuition costs, which, right, is a far outstrip of any potential savings that we could have. And we know from the consolidation and the reconfiguration work that we finished in 2018 that consolidation is not an easy process. It's challenging and it's highly disruptive to students and families. And it's also like a partial fix, and it really only puts a temporary Band-Aid on a situation that requires a longer-term solution. One item that we hear often is relative to the size of central office and the budget at central office. So I just wanted to pause and share here that this display represents the allocation of the district budget in our current year, and in that you'll see that about 58% of our budget is in direct school-based expenses. Out of the remainder, right, another 29% of the budget is allocated to transportation and tuition payments that we make to other school districts. And the remaining 13% is attributable to central office budgeted expenditures. But even within that 13%, that group of expenses, a portion of those costs represent school-based staff that are paid out of our central office budget. And the percentage of that budget is truly just central office is 8.9% of the entire budget. And so even with that 8.9%, finance, talent, HR, performance management, operations, communications, right, all of those departments provide supports to schools. So Chief Penn, if you can speak to the design and the formula that we use.
Sure. Thanks, Superintendent. So this is the second budget year that we've been able to fully use our equity-based starter model, which you're going to cover on the next 2 pages. I won't go through every detail on here, but I've become a very much a fan of this approach, even while I was still working in New Haven as the CFO there, and became aware of how Hartford was allocating resources in this manner. And I kind of like this model because it allows us to stay true to the commitment to push scarce resources to where they're most needed. Keep in mind that equity doesn't mean equal, and so within schools, you're going to see variation in terms of the per pupil spending, and that's a validation for me that the model is working, that it's the way it's intended to work. But you'll see sort of how the model works in terms of ensuring that we have a certain number of assistant principals based on student enrollment, that we have a family community support provider, one per school, that based on the number of folks that we have in the school in terms of students, how many social workers should be in that school. We then have stipends that are available on a per pupil basis. But the second page of the model really gets into the nitty-gritty to make sure that we have a more vulnerable populations that are covered that way. How many teachers do we need for multilingual learners based on the multilingual population within that building? Student engagement specialists, we've now committed to having one in every school given our chronic absenteeism rates, trying to make sure that they're engaging with the students on a weekly basis or a daily basis to make sure that they stay in school. You'll see also the middle school supplement that we have around social emotional learning, knowing that that's a fairly tough age group and that is a particularly needy group in terms of making sure that their social and emotional needs get met. So again, you know, allocating budget dollars in a school district is a challenge every year, trying to make sure that you have every expense covered and every need is covered. But this is a holistic approach that we try to take towards how do we make sure that those allocated resources are going to where they are most needed. And so I said, you know, this is now our second year of doing this. One of the questions we see from principals, and we get it from our community members as well, is what can cause a starter budget to change? And the most direct answer is enrollment would certainly be a big part of that. Anything that's allocated on a per student basis would obviously be impacted. Do we have shifts in our district model for excellence, or DME, that we need to support within that school? Revenue availability, particularly in this upcoming budget year, is going to be challenging for us, and so we may not have the amount of dollars available that we'd like to see allocated to a school. And then the last piece, ESSER funding. You know, we know that we're about to enter the last year that ESSER funding is going to be available to us. And so one of the things that we're committed to is making sure that we have sustainability to the programs that we're operating right now. And how do we look out beyond the horizon for when ESSER is no longer available to us? So with that as kind of backdrop, let's look a little bit more about how the 23-24 budget came together. And I want to take you through sort of how we got to the numbers that we did, and then equally talk through a little bit around where our mitigation efforts have taken us over the last 3 months. So in a nutshell, when we look at our budget, it basically boils down to two numbers. What are our projected revenues and what are our projected expenses? So when we rolled up all that information in the early part of January, what we came up with was our projected revenues were only going to be around $417 million. Our projected expenses were going to be around $441 million, leaving a deficit of about $24 million. That's a lot on an absolute basis, but for context, that's about 6% of our operating budget that we have in terms of mitigation that we had to do. And on the right side of the screen here, you'll see kind of what was driving that. Tuition costs going up about $9 million overall. Transportation costs going up about $6 million. Labor costs going up about $2 million, and then the normal inflation that you would see on goods and services, not unlike what you would have operating here on the city side or operating in your own personal lives, as we all do. So on the next several slides, we're going to take a little bit more of key drivers into that deficit and see where that plays out for us. So you'll see here sort of the breakdown of our revenues, and on the first line, as I mentioned earlier, is that Education Cost Sharing Grant, ECS, at about $188 million. Local taxes at about $96 million make up about 23% of our funding. Federal grants we're expecting to come in a little bit higher at about just under $28 million. State grants down quite a bit, and this is where we see that impact from that magnet operating grant. The shift in mix between suburban students and Hartford students driving a decline in that. We do have a slight increase that we're projecting in the Alliance grant as the state continues to move through its 10-year funding program on increasing the overall rate of the ECS funding. And then the last piece, private grants and tuition billing. We were estimating at about $5.7 million, which would put us a little bit more in line where our 21-22, the most recently completed year, came in. But overall, what we're seeing is about a decline of about $6 million over that 2-year period in terms of our projected revenues. Now the next page breaks out all of that in much greater detail so that you can see exactly what grants are moving in what directions. You know, the upper left block, the $284 million, that's our general fund budget, which is comprised of the ECS grant and the City of Hartford's contribution towards our revenues. The next block is our federal grants, to do, as I said, the total of it just under $28 million. You'll see called out in the red highlight on the right-hand side, the drop in the state magnet operating grant that we're projecting for next year, and the various pieces that are our third-party billing, pre-K collections, special ed billing that we do to other districts, coming into the total of just around $417 million that you see there. So it's a bit of a balancing act that we go through in terms of making estimates around revenue. Obviously, some of that is enrollment dependent. We won't know our exact funding until we see October 1st enrollment come through. But we try to take as much of a scientific approach as we can to it based on our past trends that we see and what we're seeing in the current operating year. So let's take a look real quickly at what the expense drivers are that we were seeing rolling up to that $441 million. And you'll see the biggest change on this page is the tuition line. And I kind of call the first few pieces on here the big four for operating most school districts, Hartford in particular. It's our total staff-related expenses up about $2 million. Tuition up 8.6, and that's mostly being driven by both an increase in the number of Hartford residents attending correct schools and what is now a 3-year increase in correct overall tuition rates. So our tuition per student is going up, and our overall number of students that are enrolled at CREC has also gone up, driving most of that increase. Transportation, we were forecasting to be up about $5.6 million, and that largely reflects special ed transportation. And in particular, what we're seeing being written into the individual education plans, or IEPs, is door-to-door transportation for students. We're seeing that, particularly within open choice districts where our students are attending, that they are now putting into the IEPs, which legally commits us to providing the service, door-to-door transportation for a number of students. So we're looking at ways to try to mitigate that as best as possible, but it is a very rapidly growing area of our expense base. So let me talk real quickly in terms of special ed, because I just mentioned it. One of the things that we look at very aggressively is special ed funding overall. In total, we spend on the roughly about $155 million in special ed across the district, and that's all inclusive. It's the transportation piece, the internal staff that we have, the outplacements that we have, what we pay to receiving districts for our students for the services that they provide. And when you look at the total funding that we receive, specifically dedicated to special ed, it's only $61 million. And that breaks down into 22% of the ECS grant. That's not a hard number. That's what the state would tell you is intended to be allocated towards special education out of ECS. The federal IDEA grant, our Medicaid billing, our tuition billing, the state's excess cost grant. So when our costs exceed $107,000 per student, we can receive some reimbursement from the state for those students. So for the particularly high need, but that leaves a funding gap of almost $95 million. So there's an inherent subsidy in our overall education budget that covers the remainder of that cost, because we have a highly concentrated level of need among special ed identified students within our district. And what we're also seeing is that the receiving districts from open choice, CREC, others, we're seeing very rapid growth in the special ed costs there as well, both in terms of how we're being billed and the number of students that are being identified as special ed needing special ed services. So it's something that we are continuing to work at very aggressively and trying to pull programs back in-house as best we can to deal with the particular needs of those students. But staffing remains very challenging in that space. As you know, special education teachers are a very concentrated shortage area within the state of Connecticut. It is very, very difficult to get additional special education teachers. We would love to have as many more as possible as we could to be able to fund some of those internal programs and build them internally that way, but we just don't have the staff available to us to be able to build that. So as I mentioned before, magnet school funding is a key driver of both the deficit that we're trying to mitigate in the current year and what we're projecting for next year. Within our school system, we receive $13,315 for each suburban student that attends Hartford Public Magnet School. We don't receive anything in that grant from the state for our resident students, and the logic to that argument is we also receive ECS funds for those students as well, right? But the mix of students that we're receiving is changing pretty rapidly. We're seeing fewer suburban students attend our schools, and as a result of that, as I mentioned, we've got a deficit in this year versus what we were projecting of about $7 million in terms of what we will receive from that grant versus what we expected. And of course, that rolls forward into next year as well. And for our assumptions for next year, we're assuming a status quo. We're not anticipating that the suburban population declines any further. If it does, it would steepen that deficit even more than what we projected into the current year as well. So there's complications in terms of how even the RESC operators, regional education service centers, that's what RESC translates to, like CREC, like LEARN, like others, also receive money underneath that grant, but they are allowed to charge sending districts tuition on top of what they receive. So with roughly 4,100 Hartford residents attending CREC schools right now, it's a pretty significant amount of money that we pay to CREC. And as I mentioned, they're in the process of increasing their overall tuition, $900 per student this year, a projected $800 per student next year, and I want to say $700 the year for 24-25. So even if our population attending CREC schools did not change, we would still see an increase in what we would owe to CREC on the general ed tuition because of that change that the state has approved in terms of their increased tuition rate. And this next slide in your packet actually gives you some sense of that. You can see how I've sort of projected out what 23-24 looks like incrementally, even if the student count remains the same. So you'll see here the 4,100 students that attend RESC-operated magnet schools between CREC and LEARN, and 4,200 overall is pretty significant in terms of what the general education costs. And I should point out that billings for special education are incremental to this. This is only the regular education piece. And one of the things that we've noticed recently is increasing level of conflict, I would say, between Hartford Public Schools, the state, and CREC over residency verification. Under the current statutes, we're supposed to be at a point where CREC is supposed to be validating through significant means whether or not the student actually is a Hartford student or not, so that we have the opportunity to challenge whether or not we should be being billed for tuition and for special ed services for that student. CREC, in our minds, has not kept up their end of the bargain, but they've successfully lobbied the state to do a tuition holdback. And what that means is that our May ECS payment to City of Hartford is going to have $1.7 million withheld for it, essentially held in escrow until this residency issues can be fully resolved. Now, the problem with that is it delays our funding. It creates some issues with us in terms of making sure we're made whole on revenues that we would anticipate receiving from the city. And frankly, we don't think we should be in this position. It is a legacy issue of what was embedded in the legislation that surrounded the creation of these magnet schools. But we are working to try and see how best we can resolve the matter going forward, because these ACS holdbacks are going to be problematic for us if they continue. And frankly, I'm concerned about getting this $1.7 million resolved as soon as possible. So when we think about projecting the potential impacts to our budget, you know, there are things that we sort of know, and then there's things that we're not sure of yet. Changes in collective bargaining agreements, you know, the effect of declining enrollment on grants, as we've talked about, increased costs for healthcare and other benefits, as we just came through an RFP that we did for healthcare and dental services for next year. You know, inflation on goods and services, that stuff we can kind of anticipate. Some of the things that we know could be out there that we don't anticipate, or we don't have a very clear visibility into, are increasing magnet school tuition if more Hartford residents attend those schools. Special ed services, we can have high need students move to the district at any time, some of which may require outplacements. Staffing vacancies and wage inflation, right? We still are in negotiation on a few more of our contracts right now. And we deal with vacancies on a regular basis, so we're going to touch on a little bit on that. And then, of course, the increased concentration of need that we have in terms of multilingual students and the supports that they need, and the other concentrations of need that we have within a district of our size. So it is something that we try to anticipate as best as possible, but, you know, it is a business judgment estimate is the way I would describe it. We don't know going into any given year how some of those things will trend. One of the things that I did want to point out is vacancies, because this it has an impact on both sort of an absolute level where we are right now, and in addition, it has an impact on the mitigation strategy that we're taking into next year. So in total, we had more than 400 position vacancies embedded into the budget for next year when we started the process in January, and you could see the breakdown between certified versus non-certified positions, how many of those are in the general fund, and how many of those are funded by our grants. So vacancies continue to be a significant issue for us, And in fact, we're running at about an 11% vacancy rate versus our budgeted positions right now. So that has a detrimental effect, obviously, on the student services that we want to be able to provide. It's got a financial benefit, obviously, in that we're not paying those salaries right now. But in some cases, we have to make up for those services by hiring with outside contractors, if it's special ed related, or some of the specialty providers like speech and language pathologists. You know, if we don't have those services, but the services are guaranteed to the student, then we need to go out to the outside to contract for those services. We would much rather have the staff person on board with us, but in certain cases, we need to be able to provide those services to the student, and we'll go outside to get those services for them. So one of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of mitigation is when we rolled up our budget toward the, as I said, the beginning of January, we made a commitment to the board in terms of how we were going to try to mitigate that deficit. You know, we didn't want to put them in a position of having to adopt a budget that had a $24 million deficit embedded in it. You know, initially we thought looking at vacant positions could have an impact of between 7 and 9 million. Reduction and consolidation of programs or platforms and non-personnel expenses, particularly within central office, we thought we would get somewhere between 2 and 4 million. We did propose leaving a task out there for the 23-24 year of a small amount that we would try to work to close over the next 18 months before we got to June of 2024. We did talk about using some of our ESSER funds to offset part of the deficit, and you know, we had long conversations around that because it would steepen the financial cliff that we would then encounter for 24-25. If we use ESSER funds to pay for part of 23-24's expenses, and then we didn't have those funds available for us for 24-25, it puts us in an even deeper hole in terms of what we hadn't planned for that year. So trying to not kick the can down the road, as it were, for having to deal with that at the time. And then lastly, we wanted to go back and look at all our revenue assumptions. As I mentioned, that's a bit of a mix of art and science in terms of trying to project those, to see if there was an opportunity where we were too conservative in our estimates, to see if there's and we thought overall we could potentially get to savings between 18 and 26 million as a result of those efforts. And one of the things that we made clear at the time was that we didn't anticipate impacting anybody who was already in a position. Because of the high level of vacancies, we didn't think there would have to be any kind of reduction in force to somebody who was already a staff member at that point. And we wanted to try and put staff members at ease around that issue as early as we could. So on the next slide, you'll see two different columns. The first was where the mitigation stood at the beginning of February. The second one is the mitigation at the end of February, and that's really what drove the adoption of the board when they adopted the budget in March. So just kind of walking down the column, you see the original estimate on our revenues. We became aware of a new grant that would become available to us this year, called the Tuition Offset Grant. We know that the state set aside $11 million in that grant. We're anticipating getting no less than $3 million, but we don't have a final number yet, but we felt that was a reasonably conservative number to put in. We thought we can increase our special education billing. That's billing that we do to other districts that are sending their students to us for the special education services that we provide. And as you'll see here, we're anticipating using $9.2 million of our ESSER funds to close that deficit. So then we looked at the original estimate on the expense side. We eliminated 12 vacant positions on the school side with a savings of about $858 million. We looked at our vacancy rate assumptions for next year. So when we originally put the budget together, we assumed a vacancy level of 4%. And as I mentioned to you a few seconds ago, we're currently at 11%. So the thought process was, let's increase the vacancy assumption from 4% to 6%, and that, when you add in fringe, generates a savings of about $5.4 million. We looked at a number of different things in terms of central office eliminations, both in terms of vacant staff. We consolidated, it was either 12 or 12 and a half FTEs within central office that were vacant. And in addition, went through a number of non-personnel expenditures looking to eliminate, and the net effect of all that was about a $2.2 million reduction in expenses. We did have about $400,000 that we added back in when we did our second round of budget meetings with schools. That mostly was items that should never have been cut in the first place, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't short funding anyone as a result of that. So that wound up being $411,000 that we added back in. And then lastly, the final line on here was turnover that we experienced from November, from when we started putting our budget numbers together, through the February timeframe. In that 4 months, turnover in positions wound up being in a net savings from salaries and benefits of about $1.2 million. So that took the overall expense estimate down from what was originally $441 million to about $431 million. But the remaining gap that we have going into next year, and this is that budget task that I mentioned on the previous slide, is we still have just under $2 million that still needs to be mitigated. And that could be a combination of either increased revenues, reduced expenditures, or the combination of both. And we've committed to our board to making sure that we'll be providing the regular updates on how we're progressing on that target as the 23-24 year unfolds. Okay. So at that point,
I think I just wanted to add one point of clarity in case is a wondering. It's a question that we've gotten in submitted to us in one of our forums, and that is how we arrived at the 6%. And Chief Penn, you talked about, right, we were at 7% initially in terms of 4%.
Yep.
And we looked back at other years pre-COVID at our vacancy rate, and it ranged between 4 and 6%. And so we thought that a 6% that has been the highest pre-COVID, that it was a sure right place for us to land in terms of the vacancy rate. So I just wanted to make that distinction as to how do we use information from pre-COVID in terms of our vacancy rate to get to where we were today for that vacancy assumption that, right, it equates to $5.4 million.
Thank you. So you've concluded your presentation?
yes.
All right. Were there any other questions that were sent to your office from the council that you're aware of?
No.
No? Okay. No problem. I will open up the floor to my council colleagues for questions, additional questions. Anybody? Councilman LeBron.
Thank you, Superintendent Dr. Torres Rodriguez and CFO for coming and giving us a really comprehensive presentation. I appreciate the demos and the thoroughness of bringing this before us. I want to just start with, through you, Mr. Chair, the strategic goals. How often do we revisit the strategic goals?
So our goals are in alignment with the state and federal targets that are identified, and so those are on a yearly basis we set them, but it's based on the 10-year progression that the state, as with the feds, identify for us. We do monitor them on a quarterly basis internally. We have our scorecard. Every school has a scorecard, and we make our routine presentations to our board, and we also share them with our community via the dashboards.
So the strategic initiatives that are listed in the budget book for the city would be the same as for the district, right?
Yes, the one thing that we do every year is, right, we kind of reflect back at the work streams and the actions that go in alignment with those priorities to make sure that we're still moving in the right direction and that there's not too much on the plate of our school leaders and staff.
Thank you. And I highlighted this beforehand. This is more through you, Mr. Chair. It might be a counting error. I know with all these numbers, there's likely to be that. So on page 5 of the superintendent's operating budget, on the special education funds total, I don't know if you guys have this book. It lists all of our special funds total at $145 million. In the budget book, it lists it at 139 million. So what is it? I would assume, I'm gonna make an assumption. I know we're not supposed to assume, but we're human. I would assume that this is probably more accurate than the city's budget book. I would assume that. But if you can let us know which one would be the more accurate number.
I will definitely do that. At the time that the template needed to be completed for the city's budget book, there was something that I had a footnote in our numbers, and I don't recall exactly what I did. So I will go back and reconcile the two numbers for you and make sure we get that communicated to you.
Thank you. Because 6 million, I knew, it's a big
Understand.
number.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of discussion around state funding. As we all know, we have a complicated system in Connecticut. There's 13 different funding types in the state of Connecticut. So with all of those things and all of those moving parts, who is manning the wheel, or what is our approach, or we're manning the wheel at the state level to make sure that all of our vested interests and priorities are being met?
We keep in communication with our delegation. I know that there's been recent advocacy around Bill 5003, which aims to get us much closer, right, to our funding. I don't know where it currently stands. I know that it moved out of the initial committee, and so I'm hopeful.
Right.
However, there's a larger context for us, right? It's that bill, and it's some of the things that Chief Penn referenced, right? The fact that there's tuition, there's special education costs. That's really the other one. After this, say this bill 5003 is taken care of, it's the special education.
Right. I mean, it's a shared thing across every town. Special education costs are going across. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just a trend, not only in Hartford, but across the country, I would imagine. Do we have lobbyists do we pay for lobbyists to do work at the state capitol for us? And if we do, how do we measure return on investment?
We do actually have, I think we share the same lobbying group with the city. And, you know, we engage, and we, through the lobbyists and even through our own connections with our local, legislators. There are times in which we get responses that we want, and there are times in which what we advocate for has a broader implication. Hence, you know, Bill 5003, where we know it's not just a Hartford situation, right? It's a blanket across all municipalities. And so we don't let up. We still continue our advocacy.
Sure. When was the last time we looked at the lobbying contract for education specifically? And would it be an RFP process? When was the last time we changed lobbyists?
We've had, since I've been in Hartford Public School, it's been the same lobbyist.
And would it be safe to say that since you've been in the superintendent position, our state funding or our state piece of the pie has diminished under the current lobbying firm?
No, I don't think it's a fair correlation.
Okay.
Actually, there are, I'm trying to reflect back at the lobbying work that happened when we did the reconfiguration and redesign of our district, and some investments that were made around school construction for our schools. And so as it relates to school funding in particular, we've been advocating for several years, along with others, right, that are in a similar situation, though not to the degree of impact that it is to Hartford Public Schools.
Right. So there has been some wins.
There have been. Specifically in relation to the school funding formula, we know that it's a 10-year, currently it's a
Right.
10-year, ramp
Yeah.
to get there. It's
Yeah.
just not fast enough.
Right.
If
For us.
I can add to that as well.
Sure.
One of the things that we also participate in outside of the legislative body is working closely with the State Department of Education as well. So the State Department of Education has two task forces that I'm now part of that are ongoing. They're trying to look a little bit over the horizon. One of which is a way that the grants are paid out to school districts in terms of how is that going to impact cash flow and things of that nature. But the more important one is, how do we prepare for life after ESSER?
Right.
So there's a lot of conversation that's happening even with the CSDE around, once this funding goes away, how are school districts going to be able to react? And what's the fiscal sustainability going to look like if you've now identified programs that are benefiting your students? How do you sustain those going forward?
Thank you. One last question, Mr. Chair.
Before you start, can you, Chief Penn, can you please just take down your presentation, please?
So
Thank
one
you.
last question. It may lead to a B, a 1B. So under the Chef versus O'Neill legislation that we were handed, right, by our judicial system, are we mandated to operate magnet schools?
Yes, we have to respond.
So and I just want to posit this and really yes, ma'am, doctor.
And I think we as in the city, or we as in the Hartford
Public schools, HPS. Is HPS mandated to operate magnet schools?
Yes, we are a magnet operator.
So the judicial branch or part of our government is mandating that we operate a funding structure that causes a deficit. That's what I'm hearing, right? The cost of doing business to engage in magnets. Has there been any consideration of rectifying this through the legal and arbitrary/judicial process? The reason I ask that, because I believe it's unfair to be mandated to do something where you already on a constrained district being mandated to operate at a deficit by the current constructs. Has there been any consideration through our lobbyists or through legal or any kind of advisory capacity to combat this? Because it's continuing, according to the presentation I saw, is going to continue to bleed our resources at the district level and at the city level.
So Hartford Public Schools is not a party in the suit, right? We are executing on an order to create opportunities for our young people that are integrated, right? Educational experiences. And so I couldn't speak to, but the city is a party. So is the state, and so are the plaintiffs. But Hartford Public Schools are not.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Hercules.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, first, thank you, Dr. Torres Rodriguez and Director Penn for the presentation. Certainly, I hope that I'm not the only one that has a bazillion alarm bells going off right now, and it's to be commended for sure, the mitigation efforts that you were able to take to reduce such a significant deficit, right? But the larger implication of what that will mean, the long-term consequences of that, and the fact that that's likely to continue year after year if things remain the same, should have us all really trying to figure out how we come together with some solutions. And I'm not saying I have those right now, but because I'm not there in person, I certainly want to encourage my council colleagues that we really have to come together to figure out a long-term sustainable solution for Hartford Public Schools. And I know that's going to also include our state delegation. I don't know what we can do this year. I'm hopeful that we can figure out something with respect to reducing that $1.92 million deficit that you just illustrated. But this is not good, for lack of a more artful term, because at the end of the day, our students suffer when we have these types of reductions in our budgets. As much as we try to avoid that, that's where it trickles down to at the end of the day, and that means our city suffers because we're not investing with fidelity in our most precious and important asset, which are our students, who are, the leaders of this city in the future. And so, again, I know it took a lot of hard work to get that $24 million down to 2 million, but that is the bigger implication is that it was 24 million and it's likely to continue if revenue stays the same, if and even be more because those one-time grants are no longer going to be available, and if the trends continue as they are. So it's not so much of a question, it's a comment, and it may be stating the obvious, but I think this evening and throughout the weeks as we are grappling with this budget, we really do need to be asking ourselves, are we doing the best that we can do? Are we doing the most that we can do? And what has not been done? Consolidation is certainly not something that I would want to do as a first course of action, because as was stated, it is disruptive to not only students and families, it's disruptive to the integrity of communities. You know, I come from a small town where we had one high school, one middle school, and maybe a handful of elementary schools. And, you know, Hartford was a huge eye-opener for me when I moved here, trying to navigate our public school system. And just knowing the year-over-year impact that these deficits have had, it's going to implode and explode at some point, and to the detriment of our students. So we really do need to coalesce some right minds, and not saying in partnership with the leaders at the board, and figure out a path forward, because this is not a sustainable solution. It's a short-term remedy, and we're thankful for the work that has gone into getting us here, but it's not something that we should be looking to do for year after year going forward.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Are you all set with your comments or questions?
I am, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Councilman Gill and then Councilwoman Rossetti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for the presentation and for the materials that you provided. I have a number of sort of specific questions just so I can understand some of these things. On page 9 of the presentation, I believe there's a graph that's showing positions that were eliminated, do I understand that we stopped eliminating positions in fiscal year 2021, 2022, but then there's nothing filled in for this year? So what's the situation there?
Yes, so we did have our ESSER funding, and so that allowed us an opportunity to, for lack of a better word, I heard that you're stopping the bleed.
Okay.
But, so that's what happened there, and Chief Penn, you can speak to how we ultimately ended for the 22-23.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I think the footnote should have actually said through 22-23, not 21-22. But one of the things that we are working on right now is that we have a hiring freeze in place for non-critical school functions, i.e. if it's a central office position, if it's something that can be deferred as we try to mitigate the deficit that we're experiencing this year. And we also have established a review committee for all hires that come in, particularly anything that's hired that's funded by the general fund. That's where we're paying our most attention to in terms of that. So there is ongoing mitigation work that's happening right now for the 22-23 year, but it was not, when we built the 22-23 budget in February of 2022, at that point, we didn't have visibility into some of these cost changes that occurred as the school year started. So we didn't have the anticipated need of having to do those position reductions at that point.
So am I correct then, this budget is not showing any reduction in positions in central office, and nor is it showing any reduction in positions in the schools?
For 23-24, it absolutely does show reductions.
Where do I find those reductions? I'm sorry.
I think you'll see them in the appendix, is where we captured that data.
And can you tell me what those reductions are then?
Yeah.
And I apologize if you said it during your presentation.
Yeah.
I was focused on this table.
Yeah. So you'll see on, I think it's page 34 of your presentation, the resource changes that we have lined up.
So am I looking then at, in central office, a total of 11.7?
Correct.
And in the schools, a total of 40, almost 45 positions.
Right, so those are position changes versus our 20 through 23 adopted budget. And then in addition to that, we also eliminated 12 vacant positions in the schools on top of that, and about 12 and a half positions in central office. And I'll be happy to get you the details on how those positions break out.
And I'm just interested as to a percentage, if you know or can provide us.
Yeah.
What percentage reduction is that in central office versus what percentage reduction is that
Sure,
in the schools?
we can capture that for you, sure.
Okay, thank you. Do I also understand when we're talking about these vacancies, and you've got, in page 25, showing the number of certified staff and non-certified staff
Right.
that I guess are currently vacant. But do I understand that you try to make sure that there's no vacancies with respect to classroom teachers?
Correct. We are protecting all of those, and that includes teachers, paraeducators, right? Anything that is required for us to deliver instruction and the mandated supports for students.
So we don't have the situation where we have kids that are looking at a substitute teacher for 2 and 3 months at a time.
Well, if we don't find the staff person to hire, we do have to rely on a substitute.
Do you have an idea then? Do you have a number for how many classrooms are presently without a teacher?
We can give you that information.
Okay, I would like to see that, thank you.
But just so the reference to slide 25, currently the vacancy rate is around 11%.
Yep.
Right, but I'm talking about the vacancy rate within the classroom. Because I believe you said in this report that you make every effort. You have vacancies, but they're not necessarily, you try to move them out of, into positions that aren't the classroom instructor.
We can get you the breakdown as to
So
direct.
I'm hoping that the classroom instruction is not 11% vacancy.
No, it's not.
No, it's about a 7% vacancy, currently.
So 7% of Hartford classrooms are working with a substitute teacher?
Not necessarily some have a long-term substitute. Others have students that are going to graduate in a couple of weeks to become teachers, and others are actually shared, where a teacher has to be redistributed to another classroom, or students are redistributed to other classrooms. That is the challenge that we're facing, yes. Yes.
In speaking about the number of students in the system, I know we have the graph that shows the decrease from 20-plus thousand down to 16, and I know you've given us the numbers of Hartford students who are in CREC programs at about 4,200. Does that mean that there are actually about 4,200 and 16.5, 21,000 shy students in Hartford?
Hartford residents that are attending those schools, that's correct, in total, yeah.
But it doesn't mean that we are, that our classrooms we have empty classrooms.
No, that's not where I'm going. I have a sense, and I'm just wondering if the data confirms this, that the total number of school-age children in Hartford, regardless of whether they're in the Hartford Public Schools or CREC, that the total number has been declining. It's not that they're the same and we're just losing them to CREC.
Correct.
It's been
across
declining.
our city,
Yeah.
yes.
Do we know what the total number of students was in
So that's the piece that we'd have to go back and get, is what did that look like back in 16, 17? And what was the piece of the population that was attending those RESC operated programs, Learn and Correct, and we'll go back and track that down.
couple more, if I may. And then I think it was page 21. It doesn't have a page number on my sheet, but it's the special education funding structures. Could you explain that again? I didn't.
Sure.
It sounded as though you're saying that there's a $95 million gap in what it costs us to educate these students and the revenue we're getting to do that education.
That is correct.
So the rest of our students who don't need special ed are then subsidizing all of these students who do need special ed.
I hate playing students off that way against each other, but there is an inherent subsidy in the budget for those special education needs because there aren't direct funding streams associated with special ed to cover that. That's correct.
So,
And the reimbursement, right, comes at about a 70% when we're done with all of the reimbursements. So we only get, right, we still have to come up with about a 30% to cover it.
Well, that's a tiny piece.
so just to kind of pick up on what Councilman LeBron said with respect to the legal challenges here, and to your point, you're not Hartford Public Schools is not a defendant in the Chef case, and I don't know if this is even a Chef question, but it's certainly, the state of Connecticut does have a right to education in its constitution, and it certainly harks back to some thought that the state of Connecticut is certainly not treating Hartford equally. If we're being asked through these special education students to essentially steal dollars from our other students. And I don't know if this is the case in other schools around the state or if we're unique. Do we have a sense as to where we fit into that paradigm?
Well, I can only go off my own experience, but I will tell you that this is the fourth school district in which I've worked, and this is the same thing I've experienced in all four of them. That there is this inherent subsidy that's embedded in the budget around special education because the state doesn't fully fund special education.
Mandates but doesn't fund.
The magnitude is unique to Hartford,
Yes, that I would agree.
the magnitude of the impact.
Thank you. One thing I did not, I don't think is in your presentation, I don't know if it's elsewhere, and that is student performance. The measure of, with all these numbers and your experience, and superintendent, you've now been there for 6 years or more. Where are we? Where's our student performance? How are the kids doing? Are we falling behind? Are we making little progress? What can you tell us?
Well, it depends on what of the 16 to 20 metrics that the state uses to determine that. And so if it's literacy and numeracy, we saw that after COVID, we did take steps back, as everyone else, right, across the state and across the country did. And so we're hoping through our acceleration work to get back on track. The challenge that we have, right, we talked about the vacancy rate and that 7% vacancy rate, and it's special education has the highest percentage vacancy rates. Our students that need bilingual supports, highest vacancy rate. So our children that need the highest level of support right now are not able to access those supports. And so that is going to continue to compound the challenges around performance if you look at it from that perspective. If you look at it from another metric, chronic absenteeism, right? That's a situation that we've been able to decrease by 10% since where we were last year. A lot of work, a lot of resources, right, are required to move the needle on chronic absenteeism, because we know that it's an issue that we have to address familially, at the familial level, at the community level. And so it depends, the metric, right, that we use to answer that question. Our graduation rate, has increased over the last 5 years as well. But when we think about the impact that the pandemic had and the improvement that we had made in years pre-pandemic, it is clearly evident that we have even more ground to cover now.
And this certainly isn't the first time that I've made this comment. I'm concerned certainly that, for Hartford, for its future, that the numbers of declining students and the number of students that are leaving our system and going into correct schools is indicative of a population that looks at Hartford as a place where they don't want to send their kids to school. And that has ramifications for the economics of every single neighborhood in Hartford, where your housing prices are never going to be as high as neighboring towns, and they are flatter than neighboring towns because we don't have a pool of people who want to move in, who have school-aged children. They're looking elsewhere, and I think the data is going to support that we've had declining numbers of student enrollment. And it's compounded by the fact that if you do decide to move into Hartford and you're at all concerned about the schools, the first thing you find out is that you can't get your kid into a magnet school for a year and a half or sometimes longer. If you miss the February lottery, if I'm not mistaken, you move into Hartford in March, your kid's not getting into the school you want for at least a year and a half. I know you are familiar with these problems. I don't know what solutions there are to these problems, but I think it's certainly worth it to, of course, Councilwoman Hercules made some similar comments. It's certainly worth verbalizing the concerns that we have, if only to keep it on people's minds that these are problems that need to be addressed at some level. So I just throw that out there as a thought. Last comment, though, for you, more on the minor side, but it certainly bugs me. I live across the street from one of the Hartford Public Schools, and I've lived there most of my life. And that school, for most of my life, had a couple of little lights in front of it. And about 10, 15 years ago, it got renovated, and now it looks like a minor league baseball stadium at night. So you've got a utility bill in here, and you've complained about the cost of utilities going up. Minor thing, but perhaps you should look at the exterior lighting. I don't know about the other schools, but you could certainly start with Noah Webster. You've got 8 lights on the front of Noah Webster, 8 big halogen lights on the front, and you've got 4 big lights in the parking lot, lighting up an area that has gone for most of its existence with a couple of little incandescent light bulbs next to the front door. Don't know why you need it. For my money, you could turn them off. I'll watch the school for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Rossetti?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is going to be a busy job, Councilman Gale, watching the school and everything else you do. Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, CFO. I always like to talk about, certainly it was a number of years ago, but as a product of Hartford Public Schools, certainly a different time, but neighborhood schools, there was something to be said for walking to your neighborhood school and being a part of, a neighborhood Kennelly school. And as the daughter of a teacher who gave her most every single day, this is a tragedy. And I know we're all working hard, but I know I see teachers in the audience, and, I've had people text me while I'm here, and, page 11 probably lays it out easiest for people to understand the problem, but, what is the reason? Why are we seeing this decrease? Why are we losing students? And I know maybe from your perspective it'd be different, maybe from someone in the classroom, but is there a way to stop that? And I'd like to hear something for that, and then I have one short other question.
So I also want to say that when students leave a neighborhood school, they decide to go to our magnets that we operate as well. I just want to make it clear. There are other magnet operators that also are not able to fill all of their seats, all of their Hartford seats as well. That's one issue. The other issue is that there is a lower birth rate. I want to just clarify that is a challenge that we're seeing across the country, and I believe there's just a handful of municipalities across Connecticut that are seeing an increase in student enrollment. The other piece is around the supports that are necessary to support students primarily in neighborhood schools that have a higher concentration of need. You need additional resources to provide supports for students that have been impacted their entire life by living in poverty. You need additional resources to support students that are multilingual learners, right? I had a question about grade level or proficiency, right? Or how are we doing with outcomes for students? It is very easy to just look at a number and say, oh, third grade, right? Students are not reading at grade level. If a student, like I myself was, came to this state not knowing English, I was not going to be at grade level by the end of that year. It doesn't happen that way. And 57% of our students currently are Hispanic and Latino. Over 3,000 of our students are multilingual learners. So we can look at it from that very broad lens and assume that our students, right, are not meeting proficiency and that our educators are not being successful with our students. I refuse to accept that narrative. I know our teachers are working really, really hard, and I also know that our students come to us with an added level of need. So it's that and much more. And so we will continue to support our educators because the number one, research will continue to prove this, the number one impact, the largest impact on student achievement and outcomes is the educator. Having a highly qualified educator, and that can only happen if they are supported. And that can only happen if the students have access to the supports that they need. And so I agree with you that we have to work on not only making our students want to stay in schools, but that is not going to happen unless they have access to all of the supports. It's what we hear from families. It's why we're trying to continue to sustain a community school model for our neighborhood schools so that we can have the wraparound supports for our students. And it's what we hear from teachers, right? They want to be able to focus on the instruction, but it's hard for them to do that, right? When students have added level of need and the supports are not there for them.
Just to express one more thought on that, your question as to what's changed is a pointed one. And this is as much opinion as it is fact. Chef has considerably changed the dynamic of education in the state, and I'm not convinced for the better. And while the social aims of Chef were important, and the outcomes of that are necessary, what you've also created is a model of open market competition for education in the state. And I don't think that was the intent of what the original litigation was about, but you've effectively done that, where you now have school districts competing against each other for students and using whatever resources they have to be able to do that. At one point, these RESCs, like CREC, like Learn, were designed to be a business partner for us. They were designed to provide services for us or services for small towns who didn't have access to those services themselves. They're as much a competitor now as they are a business partner. And so that's one of the dynamics that you've now seen in the last 15 years that has driven a wedge between certain school districts and the state and CREC. And I think to the detriment of the neighborhood schools that we all became accustomed to and loved when we were growing up.
Thank you. And one last thing, and it's definitely budget related, but and I see this through budget through lots of departments, but are there ways to think about costs that are continuing to increase, and for Board of Ed, it's transportation? Yeah. Are there ways to think about that? Because I'm sure other people have the same issues in a way where we haven't thought about it, that, and I'm not a transportation expert, but ways that we can start to think about how we can do it in a different way, that it doesn't have the same type of cost associated with it.
I gained the benefit of the transportation manager having the office next to mine. So these are conversations that we have on a routine basis. And I give him a lot of credit in terms of the way that he's managed transportation, particularly in-district transportation, and eliminated the need for a number of buses by consolidating routes and doing other things along those lines. More directly to the point, though, one of the things that we've had conversations with our head of special education is, how do we make sure that we have representation at the table when in an open choice district there's a PPT and transportation is being discussed? So we've had conversations with outside legal counsel around that to say, what's our best solution for this going forward? Because we can't really undo what's already been written into an IEP, but what's our ability to control what gets in there going forward? Because I think we need to get containment first and then reduction forward. I'm continuing to be concerned that this is a potentially exponentially growing problem for us in terms of those transportation costs. But I will say this is something that we look at a regular basis, is what's the best way for us to consolidate? What's our best way to ride share? What's the best way to make sure that we've got, if we don't have to have 4 different vehicles going in the same direction to the same school, can we get it down to 3 or down to 2? And those are conversations that happen all the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I have a few questions. So regarding the transportation, and every budget, this is my 8th budget, and I've seen the transportation budget increase, skyrocket over the years, and I have to imagine it has to deal with not just insurance, but also to fuel.
Sure.
Are there any other best practices that other school districts have that are large like Hartford to help with that special ed population as far as transportation? Because I live down the street from Rawson, and there are a few houses that have either the small school bus or the caravan that comes and goes door to door. So is there anything that the state can help out with regarding ride sharing or anything to piggyback from, let's say, New Haven or New Britain Public Schools that has a huge student population?
I'm smiling because when we talk about CREC and when we talk about Learn and some of the other ones, that's actually one of their primary roles that it used to be, that they would help consolidate things like that and make transportation more accessible, particularly for smaller districts, but for larger ones too. But what I will tell you is that that transportation piece that they have is a moneymaker for them. And so we again are sort of on the opposite side of being a customer as opposed to being somebody that's a partner in that process. But your point about the state intervention is a good one. That's something I hadn't considered. Is there an opportunity to look at things on more than just a district level where we have the opportunity to consolidate routes that way? And that's probably not something that we've explored yet at this point.
And I'm quite sure, thank you for that, I'm quite sure that it's too late now to have these conversations well, maybe not, because they're still in the coming out of committee and going to the floor debates. But hopefully that is something that you'll be able to speak with the delegation about, in the hopes that they might be able to slide something in, maybe in the implementer that can actually help out Hartford Public Schools, such as we're still in an Alliance District, remember, correct? Yeah. So maybe that's something that you can speak with Commissioner Russell Tucker about and the chairs of the Education Committee. The great job on doing the mitigation down to $2 million from $24 million. And I can't say that was an easy task that could take place. However, I think you had said at one of the Board of Ed meetings that the relocation from central office to Trumbull Street was first factored into your budget, correct? And now that it's not, that saves you about how much for this upcoming school district?
Yeah, so as of right now, that is still in the budget at about $600,000 for next year.
Okay. Yeah. But that rent, is that rent actually going to is coming out of the Board of Ed's budget, or is it going to come out of the city's budget?
It has to come out of our budget until
The state provides
makes
reimbursement.
the reimbursement,
Okay.
right.
And is that reimbursement from the state going to go to the city as a pass-through to the Board of Ed or directly to the Board of Ed?
Those are technical details I think we're still working through at this point.
Okay, all right. That's good to know. Part of your budget reduction, I noticed that you had an elimination of a health services staff person. In this budget, is there an increase for school-based health centers? Is it going to be level funded, or is it going to be projected to be increased? Because I know that there's a bill before the General Assembly regarding expanding school-based health centers for certain school districts.
It's level funded for us, other than for normalized salary increases and those type of things that we part of the contractual obligations that we have.
So is there an opportunity for an expansion of these services if that funding comes by way of Department of Public Health?
We can certainly have those conversations with our health office, absolutely. Yes.
Okay. All right. Perfect. And regarding special ed, and I know that's my mother's a former HPA special ed teacher. What's the marketing after trying to recruit special ed teachers? Is an aggressive marketing campaign? How much does that impact your budget? and overall, what's that actual cost as far as a vacancy?
We can get you the specific for marketing, for materials, for the outreach. It is one of those areas that we see and that others across the state, across the country, special education, is a shortage. And we're trying to tackle it from the traditional marketing and outreach, but we're also working closely with our higher ed partners to make sure that student teachers are in our classrooms earlier than they're able to be, so that we can have a direct pipeline back to us. And still, it is a significant challenge, right? When the question came earlier as to what's your vacancy rate, 7%, the majority are certified special education teachers.
That's right.
Which is an alarming rate. My last question, we always do a good job of comparing what's Hartford doing with maybe Simsbury or East Hartford or New Haven, and we already know that there has been a flight out of Hartford for the educational system going to the suburbs due to Craig schools or Chef. What other school districts that are in close comparison to Hartford are experiencing that type of same flight? And there may be none, but I'm just interested to know, is there any other school districts such as the size of Hartford that's experiencing these issues?
I will tell you, when I speak to my urban colleagues, it's the same conversation. You're nodding your head. It's the same pain point. Special education, paraeducators, math and science from pre-COVID, those are still shortage areas. This is why, right, when we think about long-term sustainability, these are structural challenges. If we see that our young people are not going into the education field, right, that already will be, right, 5-10 years from now, we'll be in a different, probably worse situation, which is why we have to tackle it from, right, all these different angles.
And just to give some anecdotal context to that, obviously I belong to a professional group of school business officials from around the state. My counterpart in Avon a couple of months ago said that they opened up the year with 0 staff vacancies. So it gives you some idea of how intense the competition is right now for teaching resources. And we're simply not graduating enough of them out of our university programs to fill the need across the state right now.
Wow. Wow, that's alarming. My last question was, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I got a moment. I'll come back to Councilwoman Surgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so very much for the presentation. I know it takes a lot of work to put a PowerPoint presentation and try to fit all the information, put information in. A couple things in answer to Majority Leader Clark, a comparison of what's going on out there. Mm-hmm. I've got friends who are teachers in Bloomfield and Windsor, and they're having the same issues as Hartford is. So I do know the competition is very stiff out there for qualified teachers. A couple things in my notes during your presentation I wanted us to go over, and that is the quality of life for the educators. You know, how innovative are we being? Because we talk about, not having enough teachers now in comparison to 5 to 10 years. And I look at other states and what they're doing for the quality of life of educators, maybe going down to a 4-day work week. What can Hartford put on the table, to try to recruit teachers, by doing a giving them a different quality of work life, I would say.
Yes, so we're having conversations around innovation and reimagining the experience, not just for students, but for our educators as well. We are working through funding from the Barr Foundation to launch an innovation network where we're thinking a handful of schools can become part of that network so that they can engage their school community in some of those potential ideas, whether you said a 4-day work week, whether it's that, we hear from our students all the time that they want more project-based, career-based internships, that they want to be part of the, getting to understand careers. And so those are some of the opportunities that we have to explore. And also, right, when we think about the innovation, it's also around the teacher, the educator experience and what that should and could look like. But we don't want to make those assumptions, which is why we want to think about it in a small cohort of schools so that they can begin to, right, engage with their community in designing some of these innovations.
So are we looking at hopefully maybe the next fiscal year?
We are actually thinking of launching the network later this summer.
Oh, awesome.
Not the innovation, but the network, so that throughout next year, they
Okay.
can engage with their whole community around this.
Well, I'm looking forward, if I'm so elected, to come back and hearing how this goes next year, because it's something I'm really interested in. One of the things that really bothers me when I looked at your chart on, I think it's page 10 or 11, the reduction of students from 2016-17, over 4,000 students going to non-Hartford public school system. And I know I hear the reasoning, wanting a better education for my child. That's why I register with CREC or on any other public schools. What are we doing to market ourselves to say in comparison to a CREC? Because I hear, I'm sorry, your name again was?
Phil Penn. Penn, yeah.
I hear you talk about the CREC schools. Basically, it used to be partnershiping with the public school. Now it's like a competition. So how are we doing marketing ourselves, to our resident to say, you may think or quote that this school or this non-Hartford public school is better, but here are the statistics.
We try to do a great job at showing the greatness that we have, not only with our students, with our programs, with the themes that we have in our schools. Our career pathways is something that we're so proud of, and that we know that our students are coming back to us. We do not have, and it's probably what I should have said earlier, we do not have an enrollment challenge at the high school level. We do not have an enrollment issue at our high school level. Our neighborhood high schools, which Weaver, for example, unexpected for us, we actually thought Weaver would be half empty. That is not the situation. Our students are coming back at the high school level. We hear that they want to be in their communities. We hear that they want to be part of the extracurricular and athletics, programming that we have. And so we know that there's a level of engagement that is different there. And so we want to continue to maximize around that. And, word of mouth matters as well. And when we have a situation in which our students, our staff, our teachers feel that some of our students are not supported, they also get to speak to that and how challenging things are for them as educators. All of those are some things that we're trying to address, because they all become vehicles for us to showcase the goodness that's happening in our schools.
One of the things a couple years ago when the hurricane happened in Puerto Rico and all the kids and families came, to Hartford, are they still here, or they have left the school system? Where are they now?
The majority of the students did stay. We actually did look at that data. And so the majority of those students are still with us.
And so would that help with the 4,000 that are leaving the Hartford public school system to the non-public school system? Looking at your enrollment right here, is that I'm trying to balance those numbers out in my mind.
Yeah.
We had several thousand, families, and at the same time we're losing, over 4,000 students to non-Hartford public school system. How does that balance out?
In terms of the students that we welcomed?
Welcomed, and the ones, are they still here? Is that the difference we're having?
You mean that specific group?
Right.
No, I would say there are other students that we get in. I mean, we are a highly transient community, and we get students in and out all the time. Not just that they're going to magnets, but that they go to other districts as well. It's just part of some of the needs that our families have. And so I wouldn't look at it from a specific group perspective, Councilman Surgeon. Okay.
Now, so I'm going to try to balance it in my mind, because we had, several thousand students moved in, a year or two ago. because of the hurricane. I know we're a transit city, but due to the bilingual education, that Hartford provides, I would thought we would have retained, a lot of the kids here.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, we had a little over 500 students that came as a result, that were
500.
impacted by the hurricane. That's why I was a little confused as to the
Yeah.
number. And so we do the best that we can in providing the supports that are mandated, like special education supports, multilingual supports are also mandated. And so to the extent that we're able to hire all the staff that we need, we will provide those supports. I can't speak to how many of our multilingual families choose to go and enroll in other programs, but I do know that when some of those families leave and we speak to them, it's because they're leaving just the city for a variety of
Whatever
needs that they have as a family.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, also in your presentation, you talked about maybe over the next several years, we may be losing about 1,300 students. And that's going to be impacting on our budget and our staffing. What are we doing to mitigate? I don't know, I think you mentioned in your presentation over the next maybe 10 years or so.
Yes, and that is as a projection based on the last agreement, the last settlement, the last chef settlement. And so we're anticipating that those seats will become open for magnet schools, for open choice, because it's not just a CREC issue. They're open choice seats in our suburban towns as well. And so some of those 1,300 seats might belong to Hartford for our magnet schools.
Oh, okay.
And families might choose to attend our magnets, as they regularly do. And so the impact happens, right, mostly at the neighborhood school.
I'm sorry, I'm looking at my note. Thank you for that answer. It was a little bit, so now I understand how that may be impacting. Now, I remember attending the MARB meeting about a month ago, and there was a legislation that was mentioned that may impact funding back to the Hartford school system, or not Hartford school system, overall, that may help with mitigate as our deficit may go up next year. Where is that legislation now?
Is it
That's
5,003?
5,003, yeah.
It's, I think it's the
Is that 5003?
5003.
Yeah.
That was, Councilwoman, that bill is supported by the Education Committee, and I don't think it's been JF yet to the House or Senate yet.
Okay, so we don't know where that is.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, but that would help mitigate our next fiscal year's budget.
The projection
Right.
is about 24 million. And so it could help. It might get us balanced next year if we actually do get.
Right, because I believe at the MARB meeting, you mentioned we may have about a $23 to $24 million deficit. You mitigate that down to a $1.9 million now, but $23 to $24 million next year. It's a huge deficit to actually try to mitigate.
Yes.
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 So one of the questions I think I heard regarding lobbyists through Councilman Nick LeBron is making sure that we are certainly in support of the legislation that will pass, will help us with our fiscal year next year.
We certainly are.
So just for context, essentially the same version of this bill was 5203 in the last legislative session. It also cleared the Education Committee, but never went to the House floor for a vote. So my concern is that if we wind up in the same place, we'll see that just die without going all the way to the full floor for a vote. There's two main things in that bill that would be beneficial to Hartford Public Schools. It would shift the burden of all the regular ed tuition for magnet schools to the state level instead of to the sending districts. So what we pay right now to CREC and to Learn would go away effectively. The second thing is that we've mentioned before, we're in the middle of a 10-year cycle to increase ECS funding in the state. It would accelerate all the remaining funding to the 24-25 year instead of going all the way out to 28-29, which is what the original program was supposed to be.
Great. Thank you. I will watch that legislation. Just one more question through you, Mr. Chair. The 16, but you said you have approximately about 16,000 students. What is the breakdown by age group or middle school, high school, elementary school? If you know that. If not, we can always send that information.
We can send you the information.
I actually think the enrollment detail may be in the budget book that went out.
Okay. Maybe I have to look.
Yeah.
I didn't.
But if not, we'll track down that page, but I'm almost positive it's in there.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll take a look at it. It's in, oh, this one? I was looking at the presentation.
Okay.
All right, then I'll get that information from there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. You're welcome, Councilwoman. Bill 5003, there was a vote to JF it, which passed 44-0, and it's been referred to the Office of Legislative Research and OFA for analysis.
You know, as you said, it went through the Education Committee, but didn't pass in the House or the Senate. So,
Yeah, it's not
hopefully.
It's not been technically JF'd out of the committee yet.
Oh, okay. So hopefully we'll get something passed this year. I know the other suburban towns probably are not so much totally in huge supporting this, but I believe that, the urban areas, Hartford, all the other towns, our cities are really in support of this because it will certainly help with our school funding.
Yes.
So thank you so very much for your presentation.
So I remember my last question. In your budget, it represents 8% of the central office. I think it's a reduction. How do you rate the hires that are essential in central office? And how many has there been?
Can you repeat the question? How do we rate?
Yes, so because you formed a PRC committee, so are the staffing levels in central office, are those ones that are highly needed because of the vacancy, or is it something that you think that you can do without? And if they are highly needed, how many have you hired within the last fiscal year?
So I actually serve as one of the 4 members of that committee. In the time since we formed the committee, I think there's been 4 proposed hires that have come to the committee, 3 of which went through for the criticality of the need, 1 of which got deferred. So we're holding off on that last one.
What are the 3, if you don't mind sharing?
1 is in our Office of Talent Management, because it was a recruiting position. So about to go into the busiest recruiting season of the year, we felt it was necessary to have that. 1 was actually in my office, as we lost an accounts payable and purchasing person. So we're trying to, that is a key thing as we go into the end of the school year. We're trying to process all our bills and make sure that our grants are spent appropriately. And forgive me, I forget what the 3rd one was that we moved forward with the hire.
Okay. Thank you.
But I want to say it was in academics. I just don't recall the exact role.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Councilman Gill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just picking up on a couple of comments that I heard on the competition between schools and the wonderful results that apparently we're having at some of the high schools. And I know you mentioned, Superintendent, having sports programs, among other things, that helps create that school spirit that causes those kids to want to go there. And I know Weber had a nice, successful basketball program this year. I know Hartford Public had a great football program this year, and I hope that those kinds of things do bring the kids back to those schools. I know, it was kind of important for me when I was at school. You focused on your school, so I'm glad to see that there's a recognition on the board side that these things are important and that there can be some emphasis. And I would just say that over time, you may find that we can transition that to the neighborhood schools and do somewhat the same thing, not necessarily with the sports programs, but with community, with building community in the neighborhood schools that then builds that support around the neighborhood schools that cause the kids to say, no, I don't want to get on a bus and go here. I want to go down to Rawson. I want to go to my neighborhood school. And one of the things that may be coming from our side of the table over to you is to ask for some collaboration on some recreation programs after school. that may help us both accomplish that goal.
Just want to get an update, so people are watching us. Bill 5003 has been JF'd out of committee and is in the hands of the Appropriates Committee for their discussion.
Further than it was last year.
Yes. Councilman Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for the presentation. I have a question. Correct me if I'm wrong with this number. I'm still stuck on the whole $95 million gap in the special education, page 21. Chief Penn, I think you mentioned that out of the ECS funding, 22% is intended for special education, correct? Who determines that 22%?
We have seen historically that number quoted a number of times by the State Department of Education. That was the intent, was to have 22% of that funding be dedicated toward special education. But it's not like there is a specific budget number that they give us in terms of that. We just know that that was the intent of how ECS was funded. So we are including that in the funding model that we presented on the slide, is that 22% of what we receive for ECS is dedicated towards special ed. But in reality, there's no set number that we have to hit given to us by the state.
So with the increase of cost of special education, the state has yet to adjust that number or to come up with a new formula to say it should be a higher percentage, therefore we need to change the formula of the ECS period just to, because I mean you will not increase the portion that will be allocated to special education and then take it away from the regular tuition.
That's right.
So it will have to go hand in hand.
That's right.
So with the inflation and all the increases of cost, the state has yet to catch up to that and say, hey, you know, of the ECS funding, we have to increase it because that 22% for special ed is just no longer realistic. So is it fair to say that?
It is fair. And I think if you were to poll the folks in my position across the state and you were to ask them, what's the highest risk area of a budget for any school district, they would probably tell you it's special education, because it's where the most volatility is from year to year.
So what happened, because it's not really a mandate, it's not really a target number, what happened if you decide that you're going to use, let's say, 40% of the ECS funding for special ed in order to bridge this gap of 95 million? What's the impact in the other areas?
Then that means that I'm pulling money away from something else. But in effect, if you think about it, with a $90 million gap already, we're effectively doing that right now.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. You got one more?
It's just a quick, through you, and maybe we could speak offline. Are we still having, I know suburban students or suburban families are utilizing, you were talking about at the high school, we don't have gap deficits in terms of scholars attending our schools. Is the same happening with our pre-K3 and pre-K4 programs?
In terms of open seats?
Open seats, yes.
I know that as I reflect on some of the conversations in our mayor's cabinet for young children, that there are open seats in early childhood spaces throughout the city and in some of our schools. Not as many in our schools as there are in center-based throughout the city.
Well, one of the things is that what I've heard, and I don't know if it's a myth or not, is that suburban families utilize our pre-K3 and pre-K4 programs because they don't have to pay. And then when their young children reach kindergarten, they pull them. Is that myth or is that reality? Is there truth to that statement at all?
We do see that some families do not stay with us in our magnet schools.
Is there anything that we can do to prohibit that or incentivize, anything that we can do if you go to pre-K4 that, you're obligated to go through kindergarten or through the second grade? Because essentially what that's doing is taking seats away from families that would otherwise want them. And there's almost a disingenuousness about it. I don't know if that's a word, but was just curious if there was any legal ramifications or the potential of any legality of changing that pattern.
So these are all, right, part of the stipulated agreement. These are seats that are opened as part of the magnet allocation. And so those would be conversations, right, outside of the operation
Right.
of Hartford Public Schools. We're implementing the chef agreement.
Thank you all for entertaining that.
Thank you very much, Chief Penn, Dr. Torres Rodriguez. Thank you very much for your presentation. We are now in recess for 5 minutes as we prepare for Chief Rodney Barco for fire and EMS. our Chief of Fire and his team, Chief Rodney Barco, for their presentation. So, Chief, take it away.
Good evening, Council Chair and Council members. Thank you for having us this evening to present our 2024 adopted budget. To my left, Chief Riley, Assistant Chief of Support. To my right is Assistant Chief Tullier, Assistant Chief of Operations. Looking at the first slide, we're going to talk about our mission statement for the Hartford Fire Department, which basically says that your firefighters and your Hartford Fire Department will provide a high level of quality service in the areas of fire suppression, technical rescue, EMS, and hazardous materials in order to mitigate any and all incidents in the city and also to protect our residents, businesses, and our visitors to our great city. We are 100% committed to doing that, and that's why we came up with this mission statement over 3 years ago. It was a collaboration between internal and external stakeholders, talking about what it is they wanted to have for services. We came up with the mission statement, and that's what your firefighters live by. This next slide is our organization chart. As you can see at the top of the chart is the fire chief with 2 assistant chiefs, an executive assistant from the chief's office, executive officer, chief's aide, EAP coordinator, and special services division. For the suppression or emergency services, as I said, Chief Tooley is in charge of emergency services. He has underneath him 4 tour commanders for our 4 different groups. The city is divided into 2 districts, north and south, which each is controlled by incident commander, which we call a district chief, and the various companies underneath. In terms of Assistant Chief Riley, who's in charge of our support services, underneath him he has management services, which takes care of the payroll and accrued leave for all of our members in the Hartford Fire Department. Also, we have the Fire Prevention Division, Equipment Maintenance Division, which services all of our apparatuses, Training Division, which conducts all of our OSHA mandated training on a yearly basis, and our Fire Alarm and Communications Division, FACT. They also manage our computers and also deals with the traffic signals, crosswalks, and things of that nature, and some of the cameras that you see around the city. So our calls for service in 22 was approximately 30,000. 19,000 of those calls were EMS. We were the busiest department in the state. If you stop for a moment and think about those numbers with 11 fire companies, that is a lot of calls for service, and your men and women of the Hartford Fire Department do it on a daily basis. The operations, our new records management system, AFD, Advanced Fire Data, we've been working on that for approximately 3 months. It was in beta. The person that owns that company was instrumental in developing our last software, which was Firehouse. So we had to switch to a new software management system because Firehouse is no longer being supported. So we were forced to go with, previously was ESO, who was then sold to, what was it? ERS. And then they were just not helpful for what we needed to be, so we sought out a software that would do what the department needs. Again, we tested that out for 3 months. We made some tweaks, and then we went with that particular software company. We have newly trained rescue technicians. That's 24 members that's assigned to our heavy rescue. They're trained in the disciplines when it comes to specialized incidents like confined space, trench rescue, vehicle and machinery incidents, or high-angle rescue. These folks have gone through a rigorous amount of training. The last training session that they completed was structural collapse, which was approximately 2 weeks. It was very, very rigid, but they passed successfully. So if you think about those specialty disciplines, the state of Connecticut has a urban search and rescue team that would deploy throughout the state in case we have an emergency like that. We have our own group of rescue technicians, and approximately out of the 24, maybe 12 members are part of the USAR team for the state of Connecticut. So, you know, Hartford has its challenges, but we have a great department. We have a highly skilled set of individuals that serve this community. So the other specialized training that we have is the hazmat technicians. We have 22 members, 22 new members. That's right. So just completed the hazardous material technician training. So our 5 ladder companies, everyone that's assigned to that company is a hazmat technician. We do have members that's assigned to the Capital Region Hazmat Team, which is a regional resource. So again, certain parts of the state, they may have a hazmat incident. They'll call out for Hartford, and we'll respond to that call. So some of the 2023 highlights is the renovations. As you all know, Station 11 was newly renovated. It's one of our crowning achievements. As you know, our fire stations are approximately averaging 70 years of age. So this particular firehouse was renovated to the extent that we've never seen before. So it's almost gender neutral. It has some significant upgrades to it, inside and out, and we just want to thank the council and the mayor's office for working with us and getting those things done. It was greatly appreciated. L&I and DPW has been spot on in supporting us in this endeavor. So Station 5 is in a planning phase. This station will be the first gender neutral station where individuals will have their own sleeping quarters and own changing quarters. We're making significant changes to move into the future for our men and women of the fire department. Our Special Services Division, again, they do the work of 30 people with only 3. They installed 336 smoke detectors. They reached over 68,000 people for services as it pertains to installing smoke detectors, fire education, apparatus displays, and even during COVID, they coordinated some of the birthday drive-bys for our citizens. They really do a lot of good work for the community. They conducted over the year 567 relocations due to fires or no heat, things of that nature. 460 of those was adults and 150 of those were children. Also, in collaboration with Health and Human Services, we distributed over 26,000 COVID home test kits during the pandemic. Our annual performance review, which is our fire stat, which you all get a presentation once a month during the quality of life presentation meetings. Again, with our old records management system no longer being supported, we had to build out those new reports. And we're continuing to build them out to the level that we had them previously. So that data correlates to the response time for each company within the city. And we'll within the next 2 months, we should have that 100% up and fully running to present to you. Public education, community engagement, reach more citizens with fire safety education. Again, that's our special services unit. They go out upon request from school systems or community NRZs and do fire education for those particular schools and community. What they also bring is the information pertaining to the fire department, whether it be a fire safety survey information or if they had a question about a burnt car that was in their neighborhood or a fire that was in the neighborhood. We bring that information, we answer those questions for them at those particular NRZs. So our equipment upgrade, average age of the apparatuses, it's as you all know, we're struggling to keep them together. Some of the cost of the parts have gone up significantly. The wear and tear on our vehicles, just for an example, the average age engine hours is 15,000 hours for any big municipality for its apparatus. We're averaging somewhere in 23,000 hours. Sometimes it's more than that. So our equipment maintenance division is consistently working overtime, not in a literal sense, but they're working hard to keep our vehicles and apparatuses on the road. So professional development training, that is the training for our 127 new firefighters and our veteran firefighters. At any point that they discover a class that they think would be beneficial to advance their career or help them become a better firefighter, we cover their time and we pay for their class if it's within the money that we set aside for those things. But we also do host a lot of classes, such as we'll be hosting. Actually, we're hosting Fire Officer 3 right now for the leadership, like our tour commanders and our captains who already has taken Fire Officer 1, 2, and now they're enrolled in Fire Officer 3. But over the years, we've hosted pump operator class, aerial operator class, instructor 1, instructor 2, and also, like I said before, those technical rescue courses. We hosted those ourselves, and we put our members through those courses as well. So as you can see, the general fund for our budget adopted for 2023 was $40 million. For 2024, $41 million, and the change is $1,322,000, a 3.3% increase, and that's due to growth increments for our firefighters, whether it be contractual growth increments or our newer firefighters who started at below base pay. So either every year, every 2 years, they get a bump in pay until they reach max salary. Next slide. So our areas of focus, maintain our OSHA mandated training. And in terms of OSHA mandated training, that is anything that is commensurate with our duties. So live fire, throwing ladders, stretching hose lines. We have a monthly training calendar that's put out by our training division. And in that monthly calendar, it tells you what you should be working on, or it suggests what you should work on for the week. So if Mondays is SCBAs, Tuesdays is ladder, Friday is driver training. So anything that is commensurate with whatever we do on a daily basis is OSHA mandated training. Our training division handles the big stuff like bloodborne, airborne pathogens and live fire training, while our company officers normally do in-house training such as throwing ladders, forcible entry, search and rescue, things of that nature that they can do on a company level when they go out into the field. A lot of times they'll survey, they'll look at a building, say like City Hall, and they'll size it up and determine how you would attack this structure if there was a structure fire in here. So those are some of the things that they do on a daily basis with their company training. Managing overtime is always a concern for ours, along with non-personnel items, keeping that overtime to a minimum. What we found in recent years is that our 127 new firefighters don't take it as much, but our veterans do. For whatever reason, I think it may be quality of life, but we started to see an increase in the 212 overtime, but we've taken steps to try and manage that overtime. We've been looking at it over the last 3 to 4, maybe 5 months, and pretty much got a good handle on some of the solutions that we've implemented. but we'll definitely keep an eye out on our overtime. Our ISO rating, as you know, we're accredited in Class 1, so the ISO rating, it's a rating that you get and on the effectiveness of your fire suppression capabilities. That factors in the fire department, which you get 50 points. Communications, you get 10 points. Water supply, 40 points, and you get 5.5 points for community engagement. So you can get a total of 105.5 points. And where our score is high enough, we're considered Class 1, and that's anywhere between 95 to 105. Accreditation renewal, again, we've been accredited, so those appraisals that we perform every year on the performance of the department in each division, how they're doing, what they can do to improve, we review that every year in order to keep our accreditation when we go in front of the board. So our apparatus replacement plan, the city has been working with us in terms of a replacement plan for our aging fleet. We're scheduled to get 2 more pieces of apparatus by the end of fiscal '24. So we continue to chip away at our old aging fleet and try to replace it with new apparatuses. The facility repair and renovation is ongoing. Again, as I said, Engine 5 is in the planning and design phase. We do have a capital improvement plan for all of our firehouses, so once we move past the planning and design phase for Engine 5, we'll move on to the next firehouse, which I believe is Engine 9? Engine 9. Next one. So here's our staff composition for the next slide. As you can see, we're about 50% of our department still lives in Hartford. We're pretty much even across the board when it comes to ethnicity: Hispanic or Latinx, 35%, African American or Black, 32%, Caucasian white. We have no one that prefers not to say, or 5% female, 95% male. Other than that, I'd just like to say your fire department is performing admirably on a daily basis. We're starting to come into the summer months, so business has been picking up, and us 3 gentlemen usually go out when there's a structure fire. Doesn't matter what time of day or night it is, just to see how the men and women of the Hartford Fire Department are performing, and they're doing great. So we want to thank you for your continued cooperation and supporting the men and women of the Hartford Fire Department and the staff of the Hartford Fire Department, so thank you.
Thank you, Chief, for your presentation. Councilwoman Rossetti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, wonderful presentation. First, I want to, on a personal note, I run in my day job, I run a homeless facility, and fortunately or unfortunately, we have to call the fire department. They come when there's medical emergencies, and I commend all of the people who come through on how they treat our clients and the respect in which it's done, and we really appreciate that. So I just wanted to say that. In the budget book, in significant features, my favorite part, 2 things. I said 1, but I lied, so it's 2. And you could probably explain this, but the $557,000, higher budgeted in overtime, is there a way to do that in a different way? I mean, is it for positions that it would be more cost effective to have someone else than have the overtime?
No, because so our staffing is contractual. We have a minimum staffing level, and then the salaries are contractual. So it's hard to say that one person is more important than the other. So each position in suppression has a purpose when we respond to calls for service, and then on the community engagement side, we can always use more folks, but we're pretty much working with the minimum. And it's not just a Hartford problem, it's you have the same conditions all across the fire service where you don't have enough FMO, you don't have enough community engagement folks, so it's not just a Hartford problem.
Okay. And then my question, and it could just be, I'm not reading it correctly, the 4 full-time inspector positions to fire prevention program, when you go to page 21, 22, you had 18, and now you have 23, so wouldn't that be 22 if you were adding 4?
Yeah, so one of them is the administrative assistant.
Oh, it's in there.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman LeBron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I just want to highlight that this is my fourth budget review with fire. And, you know, Hartford, we have a narrative, we have our lows, but we certainly have our highs. And I want to just step back and take a moment to acknowledge the Hartford Fire Department about a department, a city department that is really doing things well, right? Like, it is an example of a municipal service and a delivery service that is always executed in the best professional manner. You know, one of the things that I pride myself, you know, as most people know, I have a background in social work, and I've served over 1,000 people, 1,000 calls, if you will, to council. Not one negative phone call about the fire. Not one. Matter of fact, only positive where I've actually wrote to HR and the chiefs about the spectacular services that people provide and how they hold you guys in such high esteem. So I think it's important to acknowledge and give flowers when flowers are due. So thank you, Chief and the team, for your continued distinguished service.
Thank you.
Yes. The diversity that you also have, I think, is one of the most ideal things I've ever seen. We got to bring the gender numbers up, right? But I think you're trying to work on that. And I know there's grassroots efforts to try to help with that. But the diversity numbers, again, a reflection of, it mirrors the reflection of the city. And kudos to everyone on the team. So in regards to the amount of calls for service, Chief Barco, have you seen the HEART team impact that in a positive direction, meaning reducing calls for services for yourself? Has the implementation of the HEART team helped in any way in the reduction of calls for service?
Yes, sir. So there's two things in terms of the HEART team. So some of those calls for service that they get before it comes to fire, or it's usually dispatched between HEART and HPD. What I can say is that they are instrumental in freeing up services for HFD. So where we would be at a call for an individual having a mental health crisis for 30 or 45 minutes, we can be relieved by the HEART team to deal with that and render services somewhere else, or go to another EMS call that's like a bona fide medical emergency, like a slip and fall or a gunshot wound. So they are instrumental in freeing up services and, again, preventing those calls that we would normally go to not going to. So they have an impact. We just haven't extrapolated the number and the percentages now, but the men and women of the Hartford Fire Department really appreciate that the city was able to come up with this team to service the needs of the citizens.
Yeah, it's only been in year one, so we would imagine that the city of Hartford would grow, and in partnership with the fire department, I would imagine that the way that the delivery of service, I keep referring to that you guys provide, would be a model for the Heart team. So the last one, Chief, and this is a tougher one, I want to believe, and it's a tougher one for me trying to understand. In terms of the structure and the hours of service, right? My understanding is 24 hours on and then 3 days off. Has there ever been any research, kind of return on investment, if that structure produces the best results? I mean, it seems like it is, but I've heard that may not be the case, not from anybody within the department. Has there been any analysis of that structure, or potentially revisiting a more traditional, I wouldn't say 9 to 5 because it's not a traditional job, but not that 24 hours on type of service?
So I think from a perspective where all three of us looked at it and we canvassed the membership and we had discussions with the local as well. All three of us are a prodigy of the 3 on, 3 off. So when it was 10-hour days, 14 hours nights, and you do that for 3 days and you get 3 days off. So the transition over to the 24 hours, it was a learning curve, but I think a lot of the membership enjoyed the one and done aspect of it. So I think some stuff was lost in translation in terms of members hanging out in camaraderie on the days off. But we've instituted a process where we've given the membership the ability to work a half a shift, which also in turn helps us to curb the 212 overtime. So in terms of a hard study, we have not done that, but again, we haven't really heard a vocalization of not wanting to do 24 hours, and Hartford firefighters will definitely express their opinions if they didn't like something. So
I would imagine that. I was just thinking, just administratively, like if someone calls out sick, they're essentially calling out sick for a 24-hour shift, right? That's what would happen?
yes, sir.
So if someone called out sick, they would be out for a week, right? Because it's essentially, right?
4 days. Yeah.
Because they would have the 3 days, then the sick day,
Yes.
and then the 3 days off. So they could go to Hawaii if they wanted to, right? We're not saying that they would, but they could, technically.
Yeah, they could.
Okay, all right. That's all. It's just curious how the ops work. But you guys are obviously, to me, it works because the delivery of service is fantastic. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. I actually was going to ask you that question because I've actually heard from firefighters internally regarding the, it's not an issue with the 24 on, 3 days off, but just going back to 3 on and 3. What other fire departments have either the 3 on, 3 off, or the 24, 48? Well, sorry, 24 and 3 days off.
Yeah. So it seems only East Hartford is the only one left that's doing the 3 on, 3 off.
Only East Hartford?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So most of the departments are going to the 24-hour schedule or something similar to it.
So it's kind of like a standard,
Yes, sir.
industry standard. This has to be agreed upon by the union, correct? As part of the contractual
The
negotiation?
24-hour shift?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. So I don't foresee this changing. Last year, we asked you for a wish list, and I was glad I was able to deliver. And so outside of your Engine 5 being under renovation, is there any special needs, dire needs, that's not included in this budget that the fire department needs?
No, sir. I think with the council's help and the mayor's office's cooperation, I think we're on the right track in accomplishing our goal in terms of apparatus and station renovation. So, yeah, I think we're good for now.
But I'm concerned about the aging fleet that you just mentioned regarding apparatus, because it clearly our average hours are over the industry standard. So how many is that, is it calculated for those particular fleets? Is it just this one apparatus, or the apparatuses across the fire department?
So 3 of the 11 engines are under the hours. They're pretty much new. And how many ladders? 2? 2 ladders are under.
Underutilization?
Yes, because yeah, and those are new ladders as well.
Okay, all right.
But every other apparatus is over their hours stated.
Okay. I'm trying to get you some new equipment.
Well, one of the issues, sir, is it takes a year to build one apparatus, and if you don't jump on it immediately, the price goes up
Yeah.
exponentially in the following year. So it's hard to. What happens is, if we're promised the apparatus in 23, 24, then we won't get the apparatus until a year later, right? And so one of the ideas we were tossing around is promissory notes that says, hey, we'll get you an apparatus in 24, 25, and 25, 26, and then they start building them. And when those fiscal years come, we just pay them. But right now, we have to wait to get approved, and then a year out, wait for them to build it.
Okay. My last question, you mentioned the fact that your maintenance person, mechanic person is working overtime to make sure that the apparatuses and other vehicles are in top shape. I think we have talked about this before, but is there any type of collaboration between the fire department's vehicle maintenance crew and Public Works?
Not really, sir. It's a different skill set.
Okay.
There's so many variables involved with fixing our apparatuses, because not only is, you have the regular engine and the transmission, but you have pump tests and aerial tests and things of that nature. And you have foam inductors and hoses, PTOs. So it's a different skill set than working on DPW vehicles, because I'm sure they have some specialized skills in terms of the dump trucks and the hydraulic mechanics of it. So it's kind of hard to intermingle the two.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So for the tools that are used to fix the fire department's vehicles, does the fire department provide the maintenance crew with those tools, or do they have to provide their own tools?
So we have our own machine shop, and to my knowledge, some tools are provided, but most of the mechanics that work in the EMD were mechanics before they got there, and they have their own set of tools.
So they use their own set?
Yes, sir. It's not cheap.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like $15,000, $20,000.
Per set, or it just depends on the piece?
Like for a set, they have big boxes of the size of this table. So, and most of them accumulated them over years, but it is inexpensive.
So have they ever expressed the need a tool that they can't afford, or that the department is not providing them?
If there is a specialized tool that we need to maintain the apparatuses, we would buy it.
Okay.
And it'd be shared amongst all the mechanics.
All right. Making it hard for me, Chino. Councilman Hernandez.
Thank you. Thank you for your service. I have a question. I looking at the numbers of the detailed budget, and this is more a question for me to understand, only because the numbers themselves don't quite explain the increase, and I just wanted to know if perhaps the answer is behind the numbers. Is probably more likely some other factors that are not reflected on this budget. Under the fire prevention category, on the overtime line, and I know that the overtime is one of your focus areas, but the overtime line, it's set at $415,000, right? At the end of December, on the actual, it was reported about $63,000 in that particular line through December. So we can say that potentially the projection is that at the end of the year, it's going to be about 126,000, similar to the previous year. In 2022, it was about 122. So this year seems to be 126, somewhere along those lines. But the recommended budget shows 415,000. That's about a 300% increase on that particular line. What is the projection, or how do we came out with that calculation that for this coming year, that particular line, even though the last 2 years have been steady at the $120-something thousand range, it's going to go up to 415?
Is that for the overtime?
For what, I'm sorry?
You speaking about the overtime for FMO?
The overtime, yeah, the overtime for fire prevention.
So one of the things you gotta understand in the last 3 years was there wasn't a lot of special events due to the pandemic. So now that that is kind of cleared up, we're starting to see a lot more special events, and so concerts and you know, parades and things around the park, which require FMO to work overtime, and some of the firefighters as well. Also, we do have 4 more lieutenants than we did in the previous years, and we have 4 more in training right now. So once they get fully certified, they'll actually be working those events as well. Yep, and a push on inspections.
Thank you.
As you know, they're developing the city pretty rapidly, so that's on top of the already tremendous amount of inspections we have to do. And then also, I think the city just reinstituted the renter's license program, so that's on top of the original inspections, fire investigations, and plan reviews that we already have to do.
Thank you.
Councilman Gale.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, team. A couple of questions. You discussed earlier in your presentation the amount of relocations that were handled during the year. And I don't know if this is within your department or if this is something that Corp Counsel handles. I know we have the ability to charge back for relocations. Are those numbers that you have any familiarity with?
The amount that was billed,
Yes.
that usually comes out of housing code enforcement, but they do have a mechanism in place to recoup some of the cost. But that the billing doesn't come from the fire department.
Okay. And then, I know this question comes up, has come up in years past. I'm just wondering if there's any different thinking on it. I know various times the question's been raised as to whether our department should be, get itself in a position where it's, as a first responder, we're able to bill back for the cost and be like, I guess there's some departments around where they actually serve as kind of the ambulance and are able to then bill for it. What's our current thinking with respect to our fire department?
So I don't necessarily think we'll ever be in a position to profit off of the services in terms of billing for EMS. What I do believe is that the next step for HFD should be EMTs, right? I believe we can provide a better level of service for the citizens and visitors and the businesses in terms of a higher level of care. But, you know, in terms of billing and transport, there are some options where some municipalities use what they call split billing, and they split that bill with the EMS companies. But I don't believe it would be profitable or even assist us in like recouping some of the EMS supplies. But the level of service from EMR to EMT is worth being explored.
Are we actually moving towards that? Are we trying to get more guys certified as EMTs? Guys and
Not as of yet. If it was right to work state, then yeah, but it's gonna take some, negotiations and talks to move toward that. But as of now, we haven't had that discussion.
Last, it's not really a question, it's a comment. I recently saw one of the, I believe it was Hartford Fire Department vehicles, large SUV with tinted glass windows. And I immediately said, why in the world does Hartford Fire need tinted glass windows? I don't know why you do. I would encourage you to get rid of them. I kind of like to be able to make eye contact with people, and I think we should be an open and friendly city at all times, and tinted windows to me are not open and friendly, so just pass that back to you.
Yes, sir.
Councilwoman Surgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so very much, Chief, for your presentation. I'm really happy that the mayor has increased the fire prevention, the one who does all the inspection.
Yes.
Adding a couple more people to the budget.
Yes,
So that was really a great thing to see in the budget, knowing that, last year there was so many issues and concerns with people being, out ill. So this is a great thing I'm happy to see that happened. I remember last year in the budget, Majority Clark was giving you everything, any equipment you wanted. He gave away last year like crazy. So how did he do? How did we do with equipment? All the equipment he gave away last year.
He did great. I was very happy. Very happy.
Wow. Okay. Guess it worked then, Councilman Clark. Well, good for you, Chief. One of the things I love the concept of your breakdown of the ethnicity of your department. It's really wonderful to see. Can we credit that to your cadet classes, that, you're doing more cadet classes and more of the youth are becoming firefighters?
You can. I think it's more attributed to the recruitment process. Our Special Services Division going into our schools and our NRZs and our neighborhoods and, recruiting those folks that live, work, and breathe there. And then we're very selective in our process when we look for candidates to become Hartford firefighters.
How many cadet classes do you offer per year?
The classes are based on our numbers and attrition. So right now, I believe we got approved for 24 more recruits in the next fiscal year. And so we'll more than likely be doing a class sometime after July.
Okay. Now, don't forget, Chief, also, the city has, one of the things I saw in your budget presentation, the number of firefighters who lives in Hartford. Don't forget that the city is offering to employees, a $10,000 grant. So, you may want to tell your new recruits as they come in of this $10,000 grant so they will buy homes and live here. So you guys have done a fantastic job in retaining your employees, and you certainly, the department certainly excel at, live, work, and play, in the city of Hartford. So thank you so very much for doing that, and thank your Deputy Chief, for hanging in there with us another year. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. I always am impressed when we have a fire in the neighborhood, and I am just so impressed with your firefighters that come out and handle the fire. And I just would like to see a little bit more female, though. To be very...
We're working on it.
You're working on it?
Yes,
Great.
ma'am.
Because I was, the ones I've seen so far, you wouldn't know. They know their jobs. So thank you very much for training and recruitment of that. Good job, Chief, and, best of luck for the next fiscal year.
Thank you. Just like that, so our new captain of Special Services has been phenomenal in really promoting that division and promoting the department. And I know he's been looking at other municipalities in terms of recruitment and recruitment for women. And he's been actively working on that particular thing, which would, enhance our attractiveness to females.
Well, you certainly talked about your new department, one of your firehouses, which is new, and you have, male, female areas. So that certainly is a plus for the city of Hartford as far as recruitment is concerned.
Thank you.
So thank you again for your services. Thank you.
All right, since we have no other questions, thank you, Chief and Assistant Chiefs, for your presentation. Great job. Thank you to our Office of Management Budget and Grants for their work as well, Director Ford and his team. And so we are actually adjourned for tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to have the Hartford Public Library and the Hartford Police Department starting at 5:30. So thank you all for viewing, and have a good night.